What if I told you that in 1973, a brilliant orthopedic surgeon became convinced that the skeleton inside his body wasn't his own? What if I told you he spent 2 years meticulously planning to remove every single bone from his living body, believing they belonged to someone else? And what if I told you that when they found what remained of Dr. Marcus Holloway, it challenged everything we thought we knew about human anatomy? This is the story of a man who looked in the mirror and saw a stranger's bones staring back at him. A story so disturbing that the medical community buried it for decades. Today, we're digging it up. Dr. Marcus Holloway was everything you'd expect. From a respected surgeon at Boston General Hospital, 42 years old, impeccable reputation, hands steady as stone. He'd performed over 3,000 successful orthopedic surgeries, putting bones back together with an almost supernatural precision. His colleagues called him the Bone Whisperer. But in the winter of 1971, something changed. It started with whispers. Nurses reported hearing Dr. Holloway talking to himself during surgeries, having conversations with the bones he was repairing. When asked about it, he'd simply say he was listening to what they needed. His success rate remained perfect, so nobody questioned it too deeply. Then came the X-rays. Dr. Holloway began requesting X-rays of himself. Dozens of them, full body scans, bone density tests, calcium level analyses. He'd study them for hours, tracing the outline of his ribs with his finger, measuring the length of his femur bones with a ruler. When his concerned wife asked why, he gave her an answer that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "These aren't my bones, Margaret. I don't know whose they are, but they're not mine." The delusion, if that's what it was, consumed him completely. He began researching cases of bone transplants, body switching, even ancient rituals involving skeletal possession. His home office became a shrine to anatomical impossibility, covered in charts showing how bones could be removed from a living person while keeping them alive. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who later reviewed his case files, found something particularly chilling. Dr. Holloway had been keeping detailed surgical notes on himself. Plans, measurements, procedures for systematic bone removal that read like a horror novel written by a medical textbook. But here's where the story takes its first truly terrifying turn. The bones started talking back. According to his private journals, discovered after his disappearance, Dr. Holloway claimed he could hear voices coming from inside his skeleton, not his voice. Other voices. Multiple voices. A whole family of voices, he wrote. Trapped inside bones that didn't belong in his body. He described the sensation of his ribs, expanding and contracting independently of his breathing. His leg bones, he claimed, would try to walk in directions he hadn't chosen. His skull, he insisted, contained thoughts that weren't his own. Margaret Holloway tried everything: therapy, medication, even having him admitted for psychiatric evaluation. But Dr. Holloway was brilliant, and he knew exactly what to say to convince everyone he was simply under stress. He'd return home from each evaluation with a clean bill of mental health and immediately resume his bone research. The final phase of his plan began in September 1970-3. Using his hospital access, Dr. Holloway began smuggling surgical equipment to a storage unit he'd rented across town. Bone saws, orthopedic drills, surgical clamps, and enough anesthetic to keep a horse unconscious. He also acquired something that should have been impossible for him to get: a complete artificial circulatory system, designed for experimental surgery. His plan, according to the meticulous notes he left behind, was to replace his entire skeleton with a temporary framework made of medical-grade plastics and metals, keeping himself alive long enough to expel what he called the foreign bones from his system. Then, somehow, his real bones would grow back. The physics alone should have told him it was impossible. The human body simply cannot survive without its structural framework. But Dr. Holloway had convinced himself that his bones were parasitic invaders, and that once removed, his true skeleton would regenerate from some deeper source. On October 13, 1973, Dr. Marcus Holloway disappeared. Margaret found their house empty except for a single note on their kitchen table: "I'm going to give them back their bones. Don't look for what's left." The police search lasted 6 months. They found the storage unit, complete with surgical equipment and enough blood evidence to suggest something horrific had occurred there. But they never found Dr. Holloway until 1990-1. Construction workers renovating the basement of an abandoned medical facility discovered something that made seasoned investigators physically ill. In a makeshift surgical suite, they found what remained of a human body. But calling it a body isn't quite accurate. What they found was a mass of human tissue, organs, and skin, arranged in roughly the shape of a person, but completely without any skeletal structure. It was like finding a deflated human balloon, collapsed in on itself, but somehow, preserved. The tissue had been kept in a state of suspended animation by a crude but functional life support system that had somehow continued operating for 18 years. Artificial circulation, oxygenation, nutrient delivery. The most disturbing part, some of the tissue was still alive. DNA testing confirmed it was Dr. Marcus Holloway. But the forensic pathologists couldn't explain how he had removed every single bone from his body while keeping himself alive, or how he had survived in that state for nearly 2 decades. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, described something that still gives her nightmares. The tissue that had once been Dr. Holloway's hands had grown into strange, elongated appendages, as if they had been trying to rebuild. His finger bones from the inside out. His skull tissue had formed hard, calcified nodules arranged in geometric patterns that didn't match human bone structure. Most disturbing of all, they found his skeleton, not inside his body where it belonged, but arranged in a perfect anatomical display in the corner of the makeshift surgical suite, every bone cleaned, catalogued, and positioned as if for a medical textbook. But there were too many bones. Far too many. The skeleton displayed in that basement contained 278 bones. The human body only has 206. The extra bones didn't match human anatomy. Some were elongated beyond what human proportions should allow. Others were curved in impossible ways. A few appeared to be made of a substance that wasn't quite bone, but wasn't any known material either. Carbon dating revealed something that should have been impossible. While Dr. Holloway's bones dated to roughly his age, the extra bones were ancient, some over 1,000 years old. The case files were sealed immediately. The remains were cremated within 72 hours of discovery. The FBI classified the entire investigation, and everyone involved signed non-disclosure agreements that remain in effect today. But here's what they couldn't seal away. The questions: how did Dr. Holloway acquire ancient bones that somehow became integrated with his own skeleton? How did he develop the surgical technique to remove his entire skeleton while keeping himself alive? And most terrifying of all, where did those extra bones come from? And why did they seem to have been waiting inside his body for him to find them? Dr. Chen, the psychiatrist who reviewed his case, proposed a theory so disturbing that it was immediately rejected by the medical establishment. She suggested that Dr. Holloway wasn't delusional at all, that somehow, through means we don't understand, he had become aware of foreign skeletal material that had been integrated into his body since birth. Material that carried with it the consciousness, the memories, and the desperate desire to return home of people who had died centuries ago. In her sealed report, she wrote, "What if the bones really weren't his? What if Dr. Holloway was the first person to become consciously aware of something that exists in all of us, but which we're mercifully unconscious of? What if our skeletons aren't as individual as we believe?" 3 other cases have emerged since 1991. Always orthopedic surgeons. Always the same delusion about foreign bones. Always the same outcome. The last case was in 2009. Dr. Rebecca Martinez in Phoenix claimed she could hear Spanish conversations coming from inside her ribcage. Conversations between people who had lived in the 1600s. Her body was never found. But her basement surgical suite was almost identical to Dr. Holloway's. So what really happened to Dr. Marcus Holloway? Was he a brilliant surgeon, driven to madness by professional stress? Or was he the first person to consciously perceive something that exists in all human beings? Something so terrifying that our minds are designed to ignore it. The medical community insists that bone consciousness is impossible, that the human skeleton is simply calcium and minerals with no capacity for awareness or memory. But they said the same thing about brain consciousness until we proved them wrong. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility isn't that Dr. Holloway was insane. Perhaps it's that he was completely, terrifyingly sane, and that he discovered something about human anatomy that we're not meant to know. The next time you feel an unexplained ache in your bones, or catch yourself wondering why your skeleton sometimes feels like it doesn't quite fit right, remember Dr. Marcus Holloway. Remember that he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger's bones looking back. And ask yourself, when you look at your own X-rays, do you recognize everything you see? Because, according to the sealed files, 1 in every 50 people carries ancient bone material integrated so perfectly with their own skeleton that it's undetectable without specific tests that the medical community has agreed never to perform. Might be one of them. You might be carrying the bones of someone who died centuries ago. Someone who's been waiting patiently inside your body for you to become aware enough to hear their voice. The question isn't whether this is possible. The question is whether you're brave enough to listen.